why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is you've been doing and sort of what your experiences have been and how the genesis of the project.
So I will indeed say thanks so much for your nice introduction. Thanks for having us here. We have been married now for 45 years.
Oh, blissfully happy.
And most of it has been really happy.
Okay.
And Deb has laryngitis because she just got back from a college reunion. So I will have the rare opportunity of sort of saying what she meant to say. Right? She'll correct me. So the project is, we've lived outside the U.S. a lot. We've been in China for a long time, for about almost 4 years. We came back to the U.S. after the sort of latest financial crash. We thought, we're hearing about all the problems in the U.S. Let's try to understand the U.S. the way we would some of the foreign places we've lived. And so over the origin of this project actually would appreciate. I put an item on the Atlantic site about early in 2013 saying, we're trying to understand the city-by-city story of America. Tell us about your city and its story, the problem you've had, and how you've responded. And we got more than 1,000 essays back from people saying, come to Birmingham, come to Columbus, Mississippi, come to Fresno, come to Allentown, PA, come to Eastport, Maine. So we've been to now about 25 places for periods of a couple of weeks, and another 25 or so for shorter visits. And that's the story we've been trying to tell.
And what are some of the themes you're coming out of this travel? I mean, what's been your experience?
The main theme, and you're sharing with me in real time the miracle of me doing the talking for our family. So this is fun. Deb will chime in when she can. The main theme is one I tried to explain in an Atlantic piece early this year, which is online. I think it's called How America is Pulling Itself Back Together, which is that at just the time when our national politics is so divided and so bitter and so based on themes of everything going bad and the country going to hell and people feel like things are falling apart. At that moment in American life, city by city and community by community, people feel as if they are doing something. So one big theme we got is that where almost every place we went in the country, they'd say, well, America's in bad shape, but here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, things are going in the right direction. America is in bad shape, but here in coastal South Carolina, we're moving in the right direction. American schools are terrible, but here in Camden County, Georgia, we're having new approaches to education. So one theme is this contrast between the local and the national. I guess another theme has been a sort of reverse migration and opportunity at just the time when our national media tell us that to really succeed, you have to go to New York or Boston or DC or San Francisco or LA. You find the whole middle of the country having this renaissance of people thinking, I can do what I want better in Erie, Pennsylvania. I can do what I want better here in Mississippi. I'm going to skip to one other theme that I think may have a lot of bearing on your communities. And we've seen a lot of communities like the ones you're working in, which is the power both for good, the power either for destruction or for self-empowerment of negative self-image. What I mean is so many places we've been, in West Virginia, in a lot of Rust Belt cities, in Central Valley, California, in San Bernardino, which is right next to the town I grew up in California, there's a sense, people have a sense of being looked down on and expected to fail. And a lot of places that has a sort of self-reinforcing power, but in many, many communities, that's been the basis for a we're going to show you attitude. And I'll just give you one illustration. In Golden Triangle, Mississippi, which is the towns of Columbus, West Point, and Starkville, it's not the poorest part of Mississippi, but it's pretty poor. And they've had in the last 10 years a real industrial renaissance. A guy named Joe Max Higgins has been the entrepreneur of this. And he's a very colorful guy. He sort of cultivates color. And he was saying that one of his big successes was bringing in a helicopter factory from Airbus. And he said, here we are in Mississippi, and we're making shit that flies. We can do anything. And so I think that the power of dealing with recognizing negative self-image and incorporating it and motivating it, that's been something we've seen in a lot of places.
So I'm interested in your point about this difference between local optimism and national pessimism. And so I'm old enough now to have gone through various cycles of political change in the country, and I can't quite tell whether it's always been that way or whether we're living through a different kind of level of that sentiment. Do you have any sense of what drives that, and what can we do to change that dynamic?
Well, I'm older than you are, so I can speak to that a little bit. I think these are very different times. I think things are different now from how they've been before, and it's largely because of the intractable, constipated national government that people feel like they can barely approach and never expect to have. Oh, thank you. Okay. Where you no longer expect to be able to turn to and have anything done for. So I think that the national scene is so difficult and so fraught right now that over the past few years, people have just either given up on that or overlooked it and think that they had to move along. When we first started this project more than 3 years ago, we deliberately decided never to bring up national politics because we're from Washington, D.C., and we thought that just was not a good starting place. And until the primary elections really got going in full force, the number of times that national politics, national government came up was exactly twice. People just dismissed it. And the reason was that they felt their issues at home were so pressing, their potential was so great, their energy was strong and their focus was strong that they didn't have time to waste musing about would somebody come to their town and help them. They were going to do it themselves. So as far as how to fix this, I have no answer. I mean, we all have answers, but we can't expect that this is going to happen tomorrow. We hope that it might begin to We hope that it doesn't get worse after the next election. And, there's all kinds of politics of the congressional elections that can change that. But what we've really seen as we're going around to these towns is very much an echo of what you're describing, that people are getting together locally. They know what their problems are. They know the people in town to go to help fix these problems. They know the entities that should be involved, and that is their starting point.
You, in some of your writings, you mentioned some of the things that you would kind of call signs of a vibrant community. You mentioned the presence of civic patriots, for example. You talk about the fabric of civic engagement. And we're obviously in that world, right? We're trying to pull together different folks within the community towards a single goal. Do you see that? Does that have variation around the country? How much of that is the culture of the place versus just sort of human nature? I mean, what's your sense of that?
So I should say that both Deb and I got into this as amateurs to the world in which you all are professionals. We had never really thought much about city development or civic improvement when we began this a couple of years ago. I've mainly been a foreign affairs reporter or a political reporter in the US. And so we've been trying just to deduce from what we've seen what distinguishes the cities that are really dealing with their problems from the ones that seem really downcast, and we've happened upon the very sorts of things you're doing. And for a moment, not to answer your question, but just to give a supportive comment, I can't tell you how impressed Deb and I are by what you're all doing here, and how this is the center of what the country needs to deal both with the problems you're directly addressing, but also just the general feeling of a country that's moving in the right direction, and that in disregard of its national politics has this functional, healthy civic fabric that can make people feel as if they have some control over their lives rather than just being objects. So that is really impressive to us. We'll try to find out about your specific communities and learn more. But I guess there was a litmus test question we often asked when we came to a town, when we do our first round of meetings with the newspaper editors and the mayor and the head of the library and the head of the school system. One of the questions we'd ask them is, who makes this place go? And the answers varied a lot. It could be some business person, it could be a philanthropist, it could be a civic organizer, it could be anybody else. But the test was there an immediate answer to that question, or was there no answer? And there are a couple places, I'm thinking especially in Appalachia, where somebody, like a newspaper editor, said, let me get back to you on that. He couldn't think of who was the person who made the town go. And so when you were saying earlier about needing the civic quarterback, needing the person who's going to take ownership, we entirely agree that we can, if you see these cities on the map, for each one of those, we can name you the specific man or woman who's the place that makes, the person who makes that place go. And often it can be a group of people or sort of but you can pick them out, and these civic patriots, people who take responsibility for Sioux Falls or for Fresno, they're the ones that make the difference.
Well, there's no shortage of civic patriots in this room, that's for sure. Talk a little bit more about you talk about narrative in these places, and we spend time in working in these communities understanding their histories, and in fact we would call that the history of these neighborhoods is part of the assets, that need to be leveraged in their revitalization. Tell a little bit about how you've discovered around the narratives of these places that you've been to.
That's a wonderful question, and it's a question that we often asked at the beginning of our visits to a town, of what's the story of your town? And a lot of times people could kind of encapsulate that. We were an orange-growing town settled by people in the east, and the civic fabric of this town is critically important to us, and we've developed our health care, and we come together as a community. People can actually say things that identify their town. And the way we saw that reflected in what actually went on in the town, what was happening, was equally impressive. I'm going to talk about Redlands, California now, where we spent a lot of time during the very cold winter 2 winters ago, so we could fly around in our little plane from there. In California, in Redlands and in other towns, the public library was a very core institution in the town, and they would take care to be not only the curators of the local historical room, but to keep that history vibrant in people's minds. They ran a program so that every fourth grader in town had, as part of their schooling, and there were like 4 or 5 elementary schools in town, they would take a bus tour around town and hit all the high spots and describe to the kids, here's where the benefactors of the library lived, and this is why it's called Smiley Heights now, and on through the university. Everyone, they reported back that all those little kids went home and talked to their parents about it and say, did you know in our town? And keeping that alive. They've also stopped pouring, everybody takes their stuff that they think is important and they don't want anymore to the library because they think it should be kept in safe quarters as a kind of mark of the history of the town. So at the Redlands Public Library, they put a lot of it in the basement. They made some separate rooms and so forth. And it just got to be so much that they said, okay, we need a museum. So they bought, kind of sadly but ironically, the headquarters where the newspaper used to be, and decided to make it into the town museum, which they are doing. And so, that connection, that they are the curators and the guiders and the navigators of the history of the town from the past to the present is strong in nearly every library that we visited.
And can I just say, in addition so the town Deb is describing is the one where I grew up, and so I took with some of those little those tours as a kid, and I can attest to that. But on this power of narrative, I agree with what Deb's saying, and we all need a sense of what is the story of what we're part of. There's an American story. We recognize its contradictions and cruelties, but there's an American story, and there are religious stories that people live by. And I think in your communities, having the story of we were down here and we're moving up here, that is really a powerful story. We're hearing it yesterday in Woodlawn of here's what it was like 10 years ago, here's what it's like now, here's where we are going. And people just day by day on their journey, if they have a sense of where it's leading and where they come from, I think it gives everybody more purpose and standing up straight.
we spent a lot of time working with folks in the faith-based community, and I'm curious as to if you look at the national statistics, faith is on decline in the country, and I'm wondering whether you guys found that those institutions, were they thriving and healthy and contributors? Were they? What's your experience with the faith-based community?
What has struck us, and I'm sure will when we go seeing some of your communities, is that whatever the source of civic glue, if there's some there, things are good, and if there isn't, there's bad. It's bad. And the civic glue can be, a VFW organization, or it can be like a Catholic Sisters network we saw very powerfully in Garden City and Dodge City, Kansas, or it can be, in lots of places, it does tend to be faith-based organizations. And so in Erie, Pennsylvania, there's a very strong Catholic presence there. So I guess I think of faith-based organizations as one aspect of ways that people hold together. And it's an important one, but some other places, there are other counterparts.
Yeah. And I'd like to take a chance at this moment to segue into something about the language that we learned as we're going around on this journey, and it has to do with churches, because when we were in Greenville, South Carolina, which was the first southern city that we visited, we started talking about, for some reason I don't remember, people said, well the question that you ask in Greenville after hello, how are you, kind of the second question that you ask is, where do you go to church? And as a Midwesterner, that kind of surprised me, and I know that surprises a lot of other people who are not from the South. It's a very personal question, it's a kind of imposing question, and it makes you uncomfortable. But in the South, the where do you go to church question is your way of kind of greeting someone and also kind of getting your place, like, how do I fit you into my life? Give me some information back here. That question also happens, interestingly, in Boston and Chicago, but the version of it is, where's your parish? What parish do you live in? And people have told me in Chicago, I grew up as a Catholic, so it was a normal question. Even if you're not Catholic, people ask, which parish do you live in? And everybody knows. Anybody here from St. Louis?
High school.
Okay, that's it. It never fails. Where'd you go to high school? And I since learned in Cincinnati, it's the same question. In Washington, D.C.
It is.
And New York.
Where do you work for
Which
Washington,
is
D.C.?
the most horrible question. It's just a version of, how powerful are you? Yeah. In L.A., believe it or not, it's, how'd you get here? Well, I took the 405 to the I-10, and then, I know there are a lot of people from New Orleans here. So people told me that the real second question in New Orleans is, who's your mama? Or how's your mama? Is that true? Yes. Okay. Thank you. So that it's a really fun thing, because we all know what we're getting to at this, and it's extremely regional and local, and it makes everybody kind of uncomfortable. So a few people have offered a better question to that, which is, what's your story? So, what's your story? Which kind of tosses it back to the person to talk about whatever it is actually is important to you, rather than where do you work.
Have you, as a linguist, when you travel around the country, do you pick up on any differences in the way folks talk about issues, particularly tough issues? Is there a language barrier that you need to overcome every time you go to a different place?
Yeah. So up in the Midwest, where we don't like confrontation, people back off any kind of questions that where you really, well, I'm talking in general now, but it's where you don't want to be really opinionated, and that was almost 3 years ago, was the first time I heard someone in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, when we asked something about schools, I think. She said, well, I have to be honest with you. And I thought, first of all, people in Sioux Falls, in South Dakota, are always honest. Why would anyone say that? And why are you, what is the meaning? Why are you saying this now? But that has become to me a very interesting phrase, because I challenge you, next time you turn on any cable news network, you will hear that intro sentence from someone during a Q&A. Let me be honest. I'll have to be honest. I'll be honest with you now. And I don't know, I think it has morphed from something that's kind of standoffish. This is a signal to you that I don't really want to be talking to you about this, as almost it has no meaning anymore. So, what was your question?
I think you answered it somewhere in there. I think you got it answered. Let me ask you a different
question. But it's everywhere. It's everywhere now. It's moved from South Dakota to everywhere.
That's interesting. So, one of the other questions I had was, so the data would suggest that we are, as a country, we are segregating ourselves. If racial segregation is either flat or getting worse, we are definitely segregating ourselves in terms of socioeconomics. Is that something you looked at and have tried to observe while you were traveling these places? And is it obvious to you that that our communities are kind of dividing themselves up in ways that they didn't used to?
We looked for that a lot, and I guess my impression is that's more obvious in major metropolises where people have a lot of different choices about the suburb they're going to live in. For example, we live in DC. We live in DC itself. The Virginia suburbs have a particular political complexion compared to DC, and Maryland is different and all of that. One reason we've been interested in smaller cities and towns is precisely that they are more integral. It's still they're so yes, this pattern occurs lots of places. Anybody here from Erie, Pennsylvania? That's where we've been a lot recently. Erie is a town with a lot of industrial and economic challenges, also a lot of civic fiber. Its main problem right now is just what you suggest, that the city of Erie is demographically cut off from all of its wealthier suburbs. And so as people send kids to school, they tend to move out to the suburbs. The Erie schools get worse and worse. People move more and more. And Erie is about to close its public high schools altogether and have the kids go out to the suburban schools because Pennsylvania law says you only need to provide education until age 14. This is something that Erie is working with. So this is, on the other hand, maybe the biggest political surprise message we have to give is, given the role that immigration and divisiveness and exclusion and the other has played in the politics of the last year and a half, naming nobody in particular as the author of this, it's impressive how many communities we went to valued the idea of being open, valued the idea of including people. I'll just give one illustration. Dodge City, Kansas, where we were a month or so ago. Dodge City, famous from Gunsmoke, still lots of German tourists because Gunsmoke still runs on German TV. And you think of it as a Wild West, mainly white town, but it's mainly a Latino town now because of the meatpacking industry. The sort of civic elders of Dodge City are all mainly white. The voting population is slight majority Latino, school population very heavily Latino. But Dodge City, while it's a very politically conservative place, really values the idea that we are in this together. And proof of that is that when the Kansas government cut back on school funding, the electorate of Dodge City voted this huge bond increase for the mainly Latino school kids of the district. And so I think that at the national level, there's a lot of this keep the other out. We don't like people different from us. But at smaller scale, it seemed as if there was still some value to the idea of combining people and absorbing people.
And I would actually put that in a larger font than Jim is saying right now. There are 3 towns that we went to who have a long history of refugee intake, starting in the 70s with Vietnam. Erie, Pennsylvania, Burlington, Vermont, and Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In each of those places, at least 10% of the school population is refugee children. And I mean really refugees. Like, kids will show up anytime during the school year from Burma, Bhutan, Congo, the Somalis and now the Syrians. Some of these kids, especially the African ones, had never been to school before. They had to teach them how to hold a pencil and a book right side up. And like in the communities that you're talking about with your purpose-built communities, the organization that those 3 towns have built since the 70s, focused around the refugees, pulls in the YMCA, the churches, the schools, the public libraries, the civic organizations, all together to work around the very deep issues that the refugees need in that town to help them thrive. And they use language like, we need each other, we support each other, we are in this together, and we are better for it. So they recognize that embracing the issue that's right there before them will make them a richer community.
And I'm going to plug something Deb wrote about this. We happened to be in Erie the day after Trump was there at a big rally. And Trump had this huge rally with a mainly white crowd, mainly from the rural surrounding areas, not from Erie itself. And his theme was, everything's so horrible here in Erie, and these refugees, they're a big threat. The next day, Deb visited a Syrian refugee family in Erie and telling their story about how they'd been included in the community. They fled from Aleppo or whatever. Without saying more, if you look for Deborah Fallows, Erie refugee, you'll see a wonderful story.
But also the kind of collaboration is the word, no doubt, we have heard more in the last 3 years than any other word. In fact, in Columbus, Ohio, that word is used so often that they've shortened it to just collab. We don't collaborate, we just collab because it's easier to say. So you can, take that away and use it now, it's easier. But the collaboration among the local institutions in, excuse me, for example, it is pervasive and it's everywhere. People are doing what you're doing without knowing what they're doing. You know what you're doing. Everybody is doing their local little versions of that, not in such an organized and maybe effective and panoramic way, but the seeds of that are growing so strong. Here's one tiny example of how it gets out into the tendrils of the community. This one is from Sioux Falls, where increasingly the refugees that they've taken in have been less like native Sioux Falls people than ever, with each generation. And they realized they had a problem with local law enforcement when the police would pull over cars and immediately I'm thinking it was the Somalis, would try to bribe them out of a ticket. So they said, okay, let's figure out how to get to the root of this problem. So they had a cultural training and mini course for the entire police force of the town to help them understand where this comment is coming from and how to deal with it. You don't issue them a ticket, you don't haul them in, you don't take the bribe, you understand them and kind of get on with the business. I don't know what, you can make up, whatever kind of solution they came from, but having the police and the educators and the different institutions in town, and now the generations of refugees who are guiding the people in town on how to address those problems, is their own local way of solving problems.
I've got a question from the audience. It's a kind of shorthand, but I think basically what they're asking is, what's the role of public spaces and places in these communities? And I assume that's one of the first things you notice when you show up, like what's the quality of the sort of public space? What's your sense of that?
So this is, again, something you all know this systematically and lifelong as professionals. This has been such a revelation to us of the crucial importance of places. In bigger cities, it's a downtown that's being revived. You see around the country, you see the repopulation of the downtown. This is happening here in Birmingham and all others. But the importance of having crucial structures close to each other. whether it's the school and the clinic and the store and places where people live, so they can walk back and forth. The importance of public art in various ways, but just the gathering where people can be. It's obvious to you that this matters. We've become believers by seeing it place to place.
And not only public places, but public places of recreation. We started to say that every town has a river walk. Whether or not they have a river, they have a river walk or some version of that. And we've been on all these river walks, and you really do see every kind of people in the community coming out to do the same thing or just enjoy a nice day and enjoy the experience of being with other people. I think that both the recreational offerings, like from the YMCA, which incidentally also in Redlands, California, collabs with the hospital. I'm going off on a short tangent, but at the hospital, they have a program to deal with kids with obesity. And it was not being a successful program. And because the kids they were stigmatized, oh, I'm going to the hospital after school, I have to do exercises, until they collabed with the YMCA and set up a program to bring all those kids to the Y after school every day. And now these kids were suddenly saying, I'm going to the Y after school, not to work on my obesity problem, but to work out or play with the basketball team or whatever it was. But the role of public recreation, public spaces that everyone wants to live in some kind of beautiful surroundings and have access to those. And when it's there and everyone is there at the same time, it's a very equalizing situation. One thing I must say I have noticed in listening to all of you for the last 24 hours or so, I'm not saying a word, is the role we've seen of art in communities. And I haven't heard you all talk about that too much, but it's kind of free, and it's been very vital in places like Greenville, South Carolina. The Elementary School of Engineering, no kidding, for pre-K through 5 in the inner city, a public school that has input from GE, comes there to teach regular courses. The first graders were learning about flight, so they learned the physics of flight. Part of their whole program was, after that, to go on the river walk to the Peace Center, which is the theater in town, to see the backstage production of Peter Pan and how they made him fly, and then to go to the production of Peter Pan. The arts communities, I know, are working the same way in your town, and they've been as vital as every other bit of town, piece of town. And I know you're doing it at the YMCA. We saw them yesterday out there in Woodlawn. But I just wanted to put in an extra plug for how participatory and critical we've seen the arts communities be with every other institution that you all have too.
So I know we've touched a little bit on the national political issues that we're all grappling with right now in this time of year, but it would be negligent if we didn't ask you sort of your general sense of optimism and pessimism around how we reconstitute ourselves after we get through this election season, and are we going to be stronger for it? Are we going to be permanently damaged by it? And what's your advice to folks who are going back to these cities and trying to do this hard work? I mean, is it going to be harder for them to do this kind of collaborations, or what's your general sense of that?
I'll tell you my perspectives on the situation of the United States. I've spent most of my life thinking how the United States is doing, either by reporting internally or living externally. Point one would be, compared to any other country in the world, the United States is unbelievably well positioned. And I can give you the long. We have our extreme problems in the second Gilded Age, but if you go to China, they have 1,000 times more problems. We have strategic advantages. We have a large population. And really the only thing that is problematic about the United States right now, I would argue, is our national level politics, which is, it's not the worst it's ever been because we had a civil war, but it's sort of the second worst. You know,
That's very comforting.
It's like the 1880s or 1890s. So number one, the United States is well positioned in almost every way except national political functioning. Point two would be our national political functioning is really discouraging, and in my view is mainly a problem on one side. We're seeing, in my view, what's happened to the Republican Party in the 40 years since Richard Nixon kicked off the Southern strategy, and this struggle is playing itself out to the extent that I think yesterday John McCain was saying, well, if Hillary Clinton wins, they're not going to confirm Supreme Court justices ever, you know, until there's a Republican president again. This is unprecedented, but I think that it would be better if we had a functioning national government. You know, as we've traveled around, we see all the things that a national government has produced. Half the public architecture in the U.S. was from the WPA, you know, in the few years in the 1930s, and all the investments the federal government has done. But if we don't have that for the next while, it's all the more important that the innovation that you all are modeling for the rest of us happens. And part of our mission is to try to connect these stories, connect you with other people who don't know about you yet, and other communities and the organizations you might know about. So our mission for the foreseeable future is telling the stories of this next phase of sort of American renewal from the bottom up.
That's great. And I was just going to ask one last question before we break. You know, we call ourselves the Purpose-Built Communities Network, and we use that term deliberately because we're trying to connect these efforts around the country. And when you look at your map, you see this. It's a very similar looking map with dots all over the country. What's the mechanism by which you think you can connect these experiences, and so that folks can learn from what you've seen across this country? Are you going to deliberately try to connect these dots in some way?
I think what we have to do is what Jim has said, just keep talking about this as much as possible and keep writing about it. And we do kind of deliberately send out a lot of email to people in Fresno, say, hey, have you talked to these guys up in Eastport, Maine? Because we see mini versions of what you're doing and not as thorough versions of what you're doing. But when people hear about others who are doing similar kinds of things, it makes them feel, I hate the word empower, but it empowers them to think, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And seeing, you know, having your website there, I learned a lot from looking at that too. And to have people who are trying to work on the same kinds of problems as you all are, to be able to have a go-to place to see more, or connections with somebody in another area, just somehow trying to knit that all together by talking and writing and speaking.
And next year, for a few months, Deb and I I'm going to knock off my normal Atlantic work. We're going to stay in one place and do a book as the beginning of what we hope to be a multi-year, open-ended commitment just to connecting these stories, connecting what you're doing with the maker movement around the country, and the career technical reform education movement around the country, and the downtown movement, and the craft brewery movement, and all these other things that are finding new ways to deal with America's problems. So you can consider us your informal allies as of this moment in trying to tell your story and expand your network and connect these stories, which makes us all more powerful.
Well, thank you so much for including us in that. We appreciate it, and thank you for joining us.